In the annals of Canadian criminal history, few cases have shocked the nation as profoundly as that of Robert William "Willie" Pickton. Known infamously as the Pig Farm Killer, Pickton's crimes represent one of the most disturbing and extensive serial killing sprees in North American history. Between the 1980s and early 2000s, this seemingly ordinary pig farmer from Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, became responsible for the deaths of numerous women, primarily Indigenous women and sex workers from Vancouver's downtown East Side. His case not only horrified the public but also exposed deep-seated issues within Canadian society regarding the treatment of marginalized communities and systemic failures in law enforcement. This comprehensive examination delves into the life, crimes, investigation, trial, and lasting impact of Robert Pickton, exploring how a man could commit such heinous acts while operating under the radar for decades. The story of Willie Pickton is not merely one of individual evil, but a complex narrative that illuminates broader social issues, investigative challenges, and the tragic vulnerability of society's most marginalized members. Robert William Pickton was born on October 24, 1949, in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, Canada. He was the middle child of 3 siblings, with an older brother David and a younger sister Linda. The Pickton family operated a pig farm on a sprawling property that would later become synonymous with horror and tragedy. From his earliest years, Willie Pickton's life was marked by dysfunction and neglect. His parents, Leonard and Louise Pickton, were described by those who knew them as eccentric and reclusive. The family farm, located at 953 Dominion Avenue in Port Coquitlam, was a ramshackle operation where hygiene and proper maintenance were largely ignored. The property was cluttered with abandoned vehicles, machinery, and debris, creating an environment that neighbors often described as resembling a junkyard more than a functioning farm. Willie's childhood was characterized by social isolation and academic struggles. He was reportedly teased mercilessly at school for his poor hygiene, strange odor, and unkempt appearance. His mother, Louise, was known to be domineering and harsh, while his father Leonard was largely absent from the children's upbringing. The family's social isolation meant that the Pickton children had little exposure to normal social interactions or proper behavioral modeling. Despite these challenges, Willie showed an early affinity for working with animals and machinery on the farm. However, his social development was severely stunted. He struggled academically and was eventually placed in special education classes. His difficulties with learning and social interaction would persist throughout his life, contributing to his status as an outsider in his community. The Pickton family's financial situation improved significantly in the 1960s when the government expropriated a portion of their land for the construction of the Lowit Highway. This windfall provided the family with substantial compensation, but it did little to improve Willie's personal circumstances or social standing. As Willie Pickton entered adulthood, the patterns established in his childhood only intensified. He remained living on the family farm, working alongside his brother David in the pig farming operation. The brothers' relationship was complex, with David often taking the lead in business matters while Willie focused on the day-to-day care of the animals. In the 1970s and 1980s, Willie's social awkwardness and unusual behavior became more pronounced. He was known to local bars and establishments as an odd character who would often make inappropriate comments to women and exhibit bizarre behavior. Despite his substantial wealth from the family's land dealings, he maintained a slovenly appearance and continued to live in squalid conditions on the farm. The first hints of Willie's violent tendencies emerged in the 1990s. In 1997, he was charged with the attempted murder of a sex worker named Wendy Lynn Eistetter. According to police reports, Pickton had picked up Eistetter in Vancouver's downtown East Side and brought her to his farm. There, he allegedly handcuffed her and attacked her with a knife. Eistetter managed to escape and stab Pickton with his own weapon before fleeing the property. She was found by police bleeding heavily from multiple wounds. Remarkably, despite the severity of the attack and the clear evidence of attempted murder, the charges against Pickton were eventually stayed. The Crown prosecutor cited concerns about Eistetter's credibility as a witness, largely due to her status as a drug user and sex worker. This decision would later be viewed as a catastrophic failure of the justice system, as it allowed Pickton to continue his activities unimpeded. To understand the full scope of Pickton's crimes, it is essential to examine the environment from which he selected his victims. Vancouver's downtown east side has long been recognized as one of Canada's most impoverished and marginalized neighborhoods. This area, comprising roughly 4 square kilometers in the heart of Vancouver, became home to thousands of individuals struggling with addiction, mental illness, poverty, and homelessness. The downtown east side was particularly vulnerable during the 1980s and 1990s due to several converging factors. The closure of the Riverview Hospital, a major psychiatric facility, had led to the deinstitutionalization of many mentally ill individuals without adequate community support systems. Simultaneously, the crack cocaine epidemic was devastating the community, creating a large population of desperate and vulnerable people. Within this community, sex workers faced particularly severe risks. Many were Indigenous women who had experienced historical trauma, residential school abuse, and systemic discrimination. Others were young women who had aged out of foster care or fled abusive homes. The intersection of poverty, addiction, mental illness, and the dangers inherent in sex work created a perfect storm of vulnerability. What made this population particularly susceptible to predators like Pickton was their marginalized status in society. When these women disappeared, their absences were often not immediately noticed or reported. Many had strained relationships with family members due to their lifestyle and addiction issues. The police response to missing persons reports from this community was often inadequate, with investigators sometimes assuming that the women had simply moved on or were hiding from the law. Beginning in the late 1980s and escalating through the 1990s, women from Vancouver's downtown east side began disappearing at an alarming rate. Initially, these disappearances were not recognized as part of a pattern. The transient nature of the community meant that people often moved frequently, and it was not uncommon for individuals to lose touch with friends and family for extended periods. However, as the number of missing women continued to grow, advocates and community members began to raise concerns. Sarah de Vries, a sex worker and activist who would later become one of Pickton's victims, began keeping detailed records of missing women. Her diaries, later discovered after her own disappearance, provided crucial documentation of the crisis that was unfolding in the community. The women who disappeared shared several common characteristics. Most were involved in sex work to support drug addictions, primarily to heroin and crack cocaine. Many were Indigenous, reflecting the overrepresentation of Indigenous women among both sex workers and victims of violence in Canada. Ages ranged from teenagers to women in their 40s, though most were in their 20s and 30s. Despite growing concerns from the community, the police response was initially inadequate. The Vancouver Police Department, VPD, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, failed to recognize the pattern of disappearances or coordinate their investigations effectively. This lack of response was later attributed to systemic biases against sex workers and Indigenous women, as well as jurisdictional issues between different police forces. While women continued to disappear from Vancouver streets, Willie Pickton was establishing his farm as more than just an agricultural operation. In the 1990s, the Pickton property became known for hosting large, raucous parties that attracted bikers, drug dealers, and others from Vancouver's criminal underground. These events, often called Piggy's Palace Good Times Society parties, served as a front for various illegal activities and provided Pickton with access to vulnerable women. The parties at Pickton's farm were notorious for their debauchery and violence. Attendees included members of the Hells Angels motorcycle gang, drug dealers, and various criminals from the Vancouver area. Women were often brought to these parties from the downtown east side, sometimes willingly for the promise of drugs and alcohol, and sometimes under false pretenses. The farm itself was a sprawling, chaotic property that provided the perfect setting for Pickton's crimes. The main house was filled with garbage and debris, while numerous outbuildings provided secluded locations for violence. The pig operation was central to Pickton's method of disposing of victims' remains. Pigs are omnivorous animals capable of consuming virtually anything, including human remains, leaving little evidence behind. Pickton's method of operation was typically to pick up women from the downtown east side, often offering them money for sex or drugs. He would bring them to his farm, where he would attack and kill them. The isolated location of the property, combined with the noise from farm operations and frequent parties, provided cover for his activities. The presence of heavy machinery, including wood chippers and rendering equipment, facilitated the disposal of remains. The turning point in the investigation came in 1998 when the Vancouver Police Department finally acknowledged that they were dealing with a serial killer. The Missing Women Task Force was established, initially as a joint operation between the VPD and the RCMP. However, the investigation was hampered from the beginning by jurisdictional disputes, inadequate resources, and continued skepticism about the value of investigating missing sex workers. The task force faced numerous challenges. Many of the women had been missing for years, and physical evidence was scarce. The transient nature of the community made it difficult to establish timelines and identify witnesses. Moreover, the stigma associated with sex work meant that many potential witnesses were reluctant to come forward to police. Despite these challenges, investigators began to piece together a pattern. Geographic analysis revealed that many of the missing women had last been seen in a specific area of the downtown east side. Witness interviews, though difficult to obtain, began to suggest that several women had been seen getting into vehicles with men who matched certain descriptions. The investigation took a significant step forward in 1999 when police began to seriously consider the possibility that the women were being murdered rather than simply disappearing. This shift in perspective led to a more systematic approach to the investigation, including the creation of a comprehensive database of missing women and their associates. In February 2002, police finally executed a search warrant at Robert Pickton's farm. Ironically, the warrant was not related to the missing women investigation but rather to weapons charges stemming from an incident involving illegal firearms found on the property. However, this search would lead to the most significant break in the case. During the initial search, police discovered personal belongings and identification documents belonging to several missing women. The presence of these items on Pickton's property immediately elevated him to the status of prime suspect in the missing women case. The discovery prompted a massive expansion of the search operation, transforming the farm into one of the largest crime scenes in Canadian history. What followed was an unprecedented forensic investigation. Teams of anthropologists, archaeologists, and forensic specialists spent months carefully excavating the property. The search involved the use of heavy machinery to remove thousands of tons of soil, which was then transported to a secure facility for detailed examination. Every inch of the property was systematically searched, from the main buildings to the pig pens to the surrounding fields. The evidence recovered from the farm was both overwhelming and horrifying. DNA evidence from dozens of missing women was found throughout the property. Human remains were discovered in various locations, often mixed with animal bones and farm debris. Personal belongings, including identification documents, jewelry, and clothing, were recovered from multiple sites on the property. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of evidence suggesting that Pickton had been feeding human remains to his pigs. Investigators found human DNA in the pig feed and in samples taken from the animals themselves. This revelation confirmed investigators' worst fears about how Pickton had been disposing of his victims' bodies. On February 22, 2002, Robert Pickton was arrested and initially charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Serena Abotswe and Mona Wilson. As the investigation continued and more evidence was uncovered, additional charges were laid. By the time the case went to trial, Pickton faced 6 counts of first-degree murder, though investigators believed he was responsible for many more deaths. The decision to proceed with only 6 charges was controversial and strategic. Prosecutors believed they had the strongest evidence for these 6 cases and wanted to secure convictions before proceeding with additional charges. The women for whom Pickton was ultimately tried were Serena Abotswe, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josbury, Georgina Papine, Marnie Fry, and Brenda Wolfe. Pickton's arrest sent shockwaves through both the local community and the nation as a whole. The scale of the alleged crimes was unprecedented in Canadian history. The fact that the killings had apparently gone on for decades while police failed to act raised serious questions about law enforcement's treatment of marginalized communities. The trial of Robert Pickton began on January 22, 2007, in New Westminster, British Columbia. It was one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Canadian history, with extensive media coverage and public interest. The prosecution team was led by Crown Counsel Mike Petrie, while Pickton was represented by defense attorney Peter Ritchie. The prosecution's case relied heavily on DNA evidence and the testimony of witnesses who had been at the farm. They painted a picture of Pickton as a predator who had systematically hunted vulnerable women for decades. The evidence included DNA from the victims found throughout the property, personal belongings recovered from various locations, and testimony from individuals who had witnessed suspicious activity at the farm. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence was a recorded conversation between Pickton and an undercover police officer while he was in custody. In this conversation, Pickton allegedly admitted to killing 49 women and expressed regret that he hadn't reached his goal of 50. This recording provided crucial insight into Pickton's mindset and the scope of his crimes. The defense strategy centered on challenging the DNA evidence and arguing that Pickton was being framed by his brother David or other associates. They suggested that while women may have been killed at the farm, Robert Pickton was not necessarily the killer. The defense also highlighted the chaotic nature of the crime scene and the possibility of contamination. The trial lasted nearly a year, with testimony from dozens of witnesses and extensive presentation of forensic evidence. The jury heard harrowing details about the victims' lives and deaths, as well as the conditions at the Pickton farm. The complexity of the case and the volume of evidence made it one of the longest and most expensive trials in Canadian history. On December 9, 2007, after deliberating for several days, the jury reached its verdict. Robert Pickton was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder rather than first-degree murder. The jury's decision to convict on the lesser charges suggested they believed Pickton had killed the women but were not convinced that the murders were premeditated. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. While many were relieved that Pickton had been convicted, others were disappointed that he had not been found guilty of first-degree murder. The distinction was significant both symbolically and practically, as first-degree murder carries a more severe sentence and would have reflected the planned and deliberate nature of the crimes. On December 11, 2007, Justice James Williams sentenced Pickton to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. This was the maximum sentence possible for second-degree murder under Canadian law. Given Pickton's age at the time of sentencing, 58 years old, the sentence effectively meant he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Following the conviction on the initial 6 charges, the Crown announced that they would not proceed with the remaining 20 charges against Pickton. This decision was controversial, as many felt that the families of the other victims deserved their day in court. However, prosecutors argued that additional trials would be costly and traumatic for families without significantly changing Pickton's sentence. While much attention has been focused on Robert Pickton and his crimes, it is crucial to remember and honor the women whose lives were cut short by his actions. These were not just statistics or case files, but real people with hopes, dreams, families, and communities who mourned their loss. The confirmed victims of Pickton's crimes came from diverse backgrounds, but many shared common experiences of marginalization and trauma. A significant number were Indigenous women, reflecting the disproportionate violence faced by Indigenous women in Canada. Many had experienced childhood abuse, had aged out of foster care, or had fled from difficult family situations. Despite the challenges they faced, these women were valued members of their communities. Many were mothers who loved their children deeply, even if circumstances had separated them. Others were activists and advocates who worked to make their communities safer. Some were artists, writers, and dreamers who had been derailed by addiction and circumstance but retained their humanity and dignity. Sarah de Vries, one of Pickton's victims, exemplified the complexity and humanity of these women. Despite struggling with addiction and working in the sex trade, she was also a talented writer and activist who documented the disappearances of her friends and advocated for greater police attention to the crisis. Her writings, discovered after her death, provided crucial insights into the community and the fears that had been growing for years. The loss of these women had ripple effects throughout their communities. Families were left without answers for years, not knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead. Children grew up without mothers, and communities lost members who, despite their struggles, had contributed. The Pickton case exposed numerous systemic failures that allowed these crimes to continue for decades. These failures occurred at multiple levels and reflected deep-seated social problems that extended far beyond one individual's criminal behavior. At the law enforcement level, the response to the missing women was inadequate and discriminatory. Police forces failed to recognize the pattern of disappearances, failed to coordinate their investigations effectively, and often dismissed concerns raised by the community. The treatment of the 1997 attempted murder charge against Pickton was particularly egregious, as a successful prosecution at that time could have prevented many subsequent deaths. The failures were not limited to police response but reflected broader societal attitudes toward sex workers and Indigenous women. The stigma associated with sex work meant that these women were often viewed as less deserving of protection and justice. The historical and ongoing marginalization of Indigenous peoples in Canada contributed to a climate where violence against Indigenous women was normalized and inadequately addressed. The case also highlighted the inadequacy of social services and support systems for vulnerable populations. Many of the women who became victims had experienced trauma, addiction, and mental health issues without receiving adequate support. The closure of psychiatric facilities without corresponding community support left many individuals without necessary care and support. Furthermore, the jurisdictional issues between different police forces complicated the investigation and allowed crimes to continue. The Vancouver Police Department and the RCMP initially failed to coordinate their efforts effectively, leading to gaps in the investigation and missed opportunities to identify and stop Pickton earlier. The Pickton case received extensive media coverage throughout the investigation, trial, and aftermath. This coverage played a crucial role in bringing public attention to the case but also raised important questions about how marginalized communities are portrayed in the media. Initially, the disappearances of women from the downtown East Side received minimal media attention. This lack of coverage reflected broader societal attitudes about the value placed on the lives of sex workers and drug users. It was only when the scale of the crimes became apparent and a suspect was identified that the media began to pay serious attention to the story. The media coverage during the trial was intense and often sensationalized. The horrific nature of the crimes and the unusual circumstances of the pig farm captured public imagination and generated significant interest. However, critics argued that much of the coverage focused on the sensational aspects of the case while failing to address the underlying social issues that had contributed to the tragedy. Public response to the case was equally complex. There was widespread shock and horror at the scope of Pickton's crimes, as well as anger at the failures of law enforcement and social services. The case sparked important conversations about violence against women, the treatment of marginalized communities, and the need for social and criminal justice reform. However, the public response also revealed uncomfortable truths about Canadian society. The fact that these crimes had continued for decades with minimal public attention highlighted the marginalization of certain communities and the different value placed on different lives. The case forced Canadians to confront difficult questions about inequality, discrimination, and social responsibility. The Pickton case had significant impacts on legal and procedural practices in Canada. The scale and complexity of the investigation led to changes in how large-scale crime scenes are managed and how multi-jurisdictional investigations are coordinated. The forensic investigation at the Pickton farm was unprecedented in its scope and methodology. The techniques developed and refined during this investigation have since been used in other major cases and have contributed to advances in forensic archaeology and anthropology. The careful documentation and analysis of the crime scene set new standards for evidence collection and preservation. The case also led to important legal precedents regarding the admissibility of certain types of evidence and the conduct of complex trials. The use of DNA evidence, witness testimony, and recorded conversations in the Pickton case has influenced how similar cases are prosecuted and defended. Furthermore, the case highlighted the need for better coordination between different law enforcement agencies. In response to the jurisdictional issues that complicated the Pickton investigation, new protocols were developed for multi-agency cooperation and information sharing. Following Pickton's conviction, several formal inquiries were launched to examine the systemic failures that had allowed his crimes to continue for so long. The most significant of these was the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, led by Commissioner Wally Oppel. The Oppel Commission, as it became known, was tasked with examining the police investigation of missing women from the downtown East Side and making recommendations to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The inquiry heard testimony from hundreds of witnesses, including family members of victims, community advocates, police officers, and government officials. The Commission's final report, released in 2012, was highly critical of the police response to the missing women and made 63 recommendations for reform. These recommendations covered areas including police training, interagency cooperation, relations with marginalized communities, and the investigation of missing persons cases. However, the Commission was also criticized for its limitations. Many advocates and family members felt that the inquiry's scope was too narrow and that it failed to adequately address the broader social and political factors that had contributed to the tragedy. The Commission was also criticized for excluding many Indigenous voices and for failing to fully examine issues of racism and discrimination. Despite these criticisms, the Commission's work did lead to some important changes in police practices and policies. New protocols were developed for investigating missing persons cases, particularly those involving vulnerable populations. Training programs were implemented to address bias and discrimination in policing, and new mechanisms were established for community input into police operations. While Robert Pickton was convicted of 6 murders, investigators believe he was responsible for many more deaths. The official list of missing women from Vancouver's downtown East Side includes over 60 names, and it is likely that Pickton was responsible for a significant portion of these disappearances. The decision not to pursue additional charges against Pickton was controversial and remains a source of pain for many families. While prosecutors argued that additional trials would not change Pickton's sentence and would be traumatic for families, many felt that their loved ones deserved formal recognition as victims. In his recorded conversation with an undercover police officer, Pickton claimed to have killed 49 women and expressed regret that he hadn't reached his goal of 50. While this confession was not necessarily reliable, it suggests that the true scope of his crimes may have been much larger than what was proven in court. The question of additional victims is complicated by the method of disposal that Pickton employed. The use of pigs to consume human remains made it extremely difficult to identify and recover physical evidence. In many cases, only small fragments of DNA or personal belongings were recovered, making it impossible to definitively prove that a murder had occurred on the property. The Pickton case is often compared to other serial killer cases around the world, both for the scale of the crimes and for the social issues it exposed. Like many serial killers who target sex workers, Pickton was able to operate for years partly because his victims came from marginalized communities that were overlooked by law enforcement and society at large. The case has similarities to the Green River Killer case in Washington state, where Gary Ridgway killed dozens of women, many of them sex workers, over a period of nearly 20 years. Like Pickton, Ridgway was able to continue his crimes partly because of the marginalized status of his victims and inadequate police response. The Pickton case has also been studied in the context of international research on violence against sex workers. Studies have consistently shown that sex workers face extremely high rates of violence and that this violence is often inadequately addressed by law enforcement. The marginalization of sex workers, combined with stigma and discrimination, creates conditions that allow predators to operate with relative impunity. The case has contributed to international discussions about the rights and safety of sex workers, the treatment of marginalized communities by law enforcement, and the need for comprehensive approaches to addressing violence against women. It has been cited in academic research, policy discussions, and advocacy efforts around the world. More than a decade after Robert Pickton's conviction, the case continues to have a significant impact on Canadian society and criminal justice policy. The tragedy has become a symbol of the failures of Canadian institutions to protect some of the most vulnerable members of society. The case has led to important changes in how missing persons cases are investigated, particularly those involving vulnerable populations. Police forces across Canada have implemented new protocols and training programs designed to prevent the kind of discriminatory treatment that characterized the initial response to the missing women. The case has also contributed to broader conversations about violence against Indigenous women in Canada. The fact that many of Pickton's victims were Indigenous has highlighted the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, Méog, in Canada. This has led to the establishment of a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which delivered its final report in 2019. Furthermore, the case has influenced discussions about sex work policy in Canada. Advocates have argued that the criminalization and stigmatization of sex work contributes to the vulnerability of sex workers and makes them targets for violence. The Pickton case has been cited in debates about legal and policy approaches to sex work. The physical legacy of the case is also significant. The Pickton farm has been demolished, and the property has been returned to the Pickton family. However, the site remains a powerful symbol of the tragedy and continues to be a place of remembrance for the families of victims. The story of Robert Pickton and his crimes represents one of the darkest chapters in Canadian criminal history. The scale of his crimes, the length of time they continued, and the systemic failures that allowed them to occur combined to create a tragedy of almost unimaginable proportions. Yet the Pickton case is more than just the story of one man's evil actions. It is a mirror that reflects broader social problems and institutional failures that continue to affect vulnerable communities today. The discrimination and marginalization faced by sex workers and indigenous women, the inadequate response of law enforcement to crimes against these communities, and the broader social indifference to the suffering of marginalized people are all part of the larger story that the Pickton case tells. The women who died at Pickton's hands were failed by multiple systems that should have protected them. They were failed by a child welfare system that did not adequately support them in their youth, by social services that did not provide adequate support for their addiction and mental health issues, by a criminal justice system that did not take their safety seriously, and by a broader society that marginalized and stigmatized them. But their stories are not just about failure and tragedy. Many of these women showed remarkable resilience and strength in the face of incredible adversity. They formed communities of mutual support, they advocated for each other's safety, and they maintained their humanity and dignity despite the dehumanizing circumstances they faced. The legacy of the Pickton case must be measured not just in terms of the changes it has brought about in police procedures and criminal justice policies, but in terms of whether it has led to meaningful progress in addressing the underlying social conditions that made these crimes possible. While some important reforms have been implemented, many of the fundamental issues that contributed to the tragedy remain unresolved. The crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women continues in Canada, with new cases reported regularly. Sex workers continue to face high rates of violence and discrimination. Marginalized communities continue to experience inadequate support from social services and law enforcement. As we remember the victims of Robert Pickton's crimes, we must also commit to addressing the ongoing injustices that affect similar communities today. The true measure of justice for these women will not be found in the punishment of their killer, but in the creation of a society where all people are valued and protected, regardless of their circumstances or background. The Pickton case serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of social inequality, discrimination, and indifference. It challenges us to examine our own attitudes and assumptions about marginalized communities and to work toward a more just and equitable society. Only by addressing these deeper issues can we hope to prevent similar tragedies in the future and honor the memory of the women whose lives were so brutally cut short. In the end, the story of Robert Pickton is not just about one man's crimes, but about the kind of society we choose to be. It is a call to action for all of us to do better, to care more, and to ensure that no one is forgotten or left behind. The women who died deserved better from all of us, and it is our responsibility to ensure that their deaths were not in vain.